There's something fascinating about the way certain movie trailers feel less like advertisements and more like emotional warnings. You watch them once, maybe twice, and even after the screen goes dark, there's still this strange pressure sitting in your chest because the footage wasn't trying to impress you with spectacle. It was trying to unsettle you quietly. That's exactly the feeling I had the first time I watched the trailer for Meaty Max. And honestly, the smartest thing this marketing campaign did was refuse to explain itself too much. In a time where trailers practically summarize entire third acts before a movie even releases, this one moved in the opposite direction. It trusted atmosphere. It trusted silence. It trusted the audience enough to let confusion become part of the experience. And you notice that immediately from the opening shot. No dramatic orchestral blast. No rapid-fire montage. No giant title card screaming from the screen. Instead, the trailer opens with this washed-out winter lighting over a nearly empty suburban street, and there's a softness to the cinematography that almost tricks you into thinking you're watching a family drama. The camera stays still longer than modern trailers usually allow. A woman stands outside a modest house carrying grocery bags while wind pushes dead leaves across the sidewalk. That image alone tells you more about the movie's emotional direction than 10 lines of exposition ever could. There's loneliness in the frame. Real loneliness. Not cinematic loneliness. Human loneliness. Then the sound design starts creeping in. A faint metallic hum under the dialogue. Barely noticeable at first. You almost feel it more than hear it. That's one thing the trailer editors clearly understood. Psychological tension works better when the audience discovers discomfort subconsciously instead of having fear announced to them. By the time the main character enters the house and the camera drifts down the hallway, your brain is already anticipating something wrong, even though nothing overtly frightening has happened yet. That restraint reminded me of older thrillers from the late 90s and early 2000s where filmmakers weren't terrified of stillness. Movies back then sometimes allowed scenes to breathe. Scenes built from that philosophy. The trailer isn't desperate for your attention. It assumes if you're emotionally intelligent enough, you'll lean closer on your own. And then we meet Claire. The trailer introduces her in fragments rather than clean exposition. We see her waking up suddenly in the middle of the night. We see her sitting inside a parked car, gripping the steering wheel too tightly. There's a quick shot of her staring at an old family photograph where someone's face has been scratched out. The editing never clarifies whether she's grieving somebody, hiding something, or mentally unraveling. Maybe all three. But what really sells the character is the performance in her eyes. The actress playing Claire doesn't perform trauma in the exaggerated Hollywood way, where every emotion is screaming and tears. She looks exhausted, like somebody who hasn't slept properly in months. There's a realism to that kind of pain that's much harder to fake on screen. One thing I genuinely appreciated is how the trailer avoids turning mental instability into entertainment spectacle. A lot of thrillers market themselves by making the protagonist look crazy in flashy ways. Here, the tension feels rooted in emotional damage rather than gimmicks. That difference matters because it changes how audiences connect with the character. You don't watch Claire like she's a puzzle box. You watch her like somebody drowning slowly while trying to pretend she's functioning normally. And honestly, the trailer's visual language keeps reinforcing that idea over and over. The house itself almost becomes another character. Not in the haunted mansion cliché sense either. It's just an ordinary house. but the framing makes it feel emotionally infected. Narrow hallways, half-open doors, rooms lit only by television glow. There's one shot midway through the trailer where Claire walks into the kitchen at 2 a.m. and the camera stays behind her from a distance while she freezes in place. We never see what she's looking at. The trailer cuts away before revealing anything. That's confidence. Modern horror marketing usually cannot resist showing the scare. This trailer understands anticipation is scarier than payoff. Another thing that stood out to me is how carefully the trailer uses dialogue. There are long stretches where almost nobody speaks. When lines finally do arrive, they matter. One of the strongest moments comes from a scene between Claire and a therapist who quietly asks, "Do you still believe the house is protecting you?" That line changes the entire meaning of the title instantly, because suddenly, shelter isn't just physical. It becomes emotional shelter, psychological shelter, maybe even denial itself functioning as shelter. That's where the trailer becomes really interesting. You start realizing the movie might not actually be about surviving external danger. It might be about what people build around themselves to survive emotionally after catastrophe. And if that's the direction the full film takes, there's potential for something much heavier than a conventional studio thriller. The editing rhythm also deserves credit because it escalates tension without losing coherence. The first minute feels grounded and intimate. By the second minute, reality itself starts feeling unstable. There are flashes of distorted imagery. A child standing motionless in a hallway, lights flickering during a storm, Claire hearing footsteps upstairs while she's visibly alone downstairs. But the trailer never becomes chaotic. Every image feels emotionally connected to her mental state. I especially liked one sequence where Claire listens to old cassette recordings while sitting on the bedroom floor. The audio crackles, and we hear what sounds like a child laughing before the tape abruptly distorts into static. It's such an old-school thriller detail, but it works because the movie appears interested in memory and emotional residue rather than cheap, supernatural mythology. The best psychological horror always blurs whether the threat is external or internal, seems fully aware of that tradition. And visually, the trailer avoids the over-processed gray-blue color grading that so many modern thrillers fall into. The cinematography has texture, warm, practical lighting mixed with cold shadows, rain-soaked windows, dust floating through dim rooms. There's an almost tactile quality to the imagery that makes the environment feel lived in instead of manufactured on a soundstage. You can also tell the filmmakers are drawing from grief-centered storytelling without directly copying the recent elevated horror trend. For the last decade, Hollywood has been flooded with trauma as horror films, and honestly, some of them started feeling emotionally manipulative after a while. But the trailer feels more restrained than that. It doesn't scream its themes at you. It lets them leak slowly through behavior, framing, and silence. Even the music choice reflects that restraint. There's no huge bass drop moment, no dramatic choir explosion. Instead, the score builds around fragile piano notes, layered under ambient industrial sounds. By the trailer's final 30 seconds, the music almost dissolves into pure tension noise. You stop processing melody entirely and start focusing on breathing patterns, footsteps, creaking floors. It becomes sensory rather than musical. Then comes the final shot. And this is where I realized the marketing team completely understood the tone they were selling. Claire opens a basement door after hearing something below her house. The camera doesn't rush forward. It slowly tracks behind her while darkness fills nearly the entire frame. She whispers something we can barely hear. Maybe a name, maybe a plea. And just before she reaches the bottom step, the screen cuts to black. No jump scare, no monster reveal, no loud sound effect, just silence. And honestly, that silence hit harder than most horror trailers' biggest scare moments, because your imagination immediately starts filling the emptiness with possibilities. The trailer leaves you emotionally suspended instead of satisfied, which is exactly what psychological thrillers should do. What I also find interesting is how the movie seems positioned between multiple genres without fully belonging to any single one. There are horror elements here, definitely. But the trailer also feels deeply dramatic. At moments, it almost resembles an indie grief story. Then suddenly, it slips into paranoia thriller territory. That hybrid identity could either become the film's greatest strength or its biggest risk, depending on execution. Audiences today are weirdly divided on slow burn storytelling. Some viewers want constant payoff every 5 minutes. Others miss movies that trust atmosphere and patience. Looks like it's unapologetically targeting the second group. And personally, I respect that. Because there's something refreshing about a movie trailer willing to feel emotionally mature, not serious in a pretentious way. Just mature enough to understand fear isn't always loud. Sometimes fear is waking up every day inside memories you can't escape. Sometimes fear is isolation. Sometimes fear is realizing the place you feel safest might also be the thing trapping you emotionally. That appears to be the real engine underneath this film. Not ghosts, not violence, not spectacle, but emotional imprisonment disguised as protection. And if the full movie actually commits to those ideas, instead of abandoning them for generic third-act chaos, this could quietly become one of the more interesting psychological thrillers in recent years, because the trailer already understands a truth many horror filmmakers forget. Audiences are far more disturbed by emotional honesty than by monsters. The most haunting thing in this trailer isn't the darkness inside the house. It's the exhaustion inside Claire's face. The deeper I started digging into the actual story behind, the more I realized this isn't really structured like a traditional Hollywood suspense movie at all. It wears that skin on the surface. Isolated house, emotionally unstable protagonist, fragments of trauma, strange noises in the middle of the night. But underneath all of that, the movie is operating more like a slow emotional autopsy. The plot keeps moving forward technically, but emotionally, it feels like somebody peeling old scars open layer by layer and realizing the damage underneath never healed correctly in the first place. The film opens several months after the death of Claire's younger brother, Daniel, who disappeared during a winter hiking trip in northern Oregon. And the important detail here is that nobody ever found the body. That matters because unresolved grief behaves differently than ordinary grief. When death has no physical conclusion, the mind refuses to accept permanence. The movie understands that psychological reality immediately. Claire returns to her childhood home after their mother suffers a stroke and is transferred into assisted care. The house has been sitting empty for nearly a year, and from the very first moment she unlocks the front door, you can feel the emotional weight crushing her before any horror elements even begin. The film spends a surprising amount of time simply observing her exist inside that environment again. She walks through rooms filled with covered furniture. She finds old voicemail recordings stored on outdated answering machines. She opens closets and freezes after recognizing the smell of her childhood home. Those scenes are quiet, but they're incredibly specific emotionally. Anybody who has ever returned to a house attached to painful memories knows exactly what that feeling is like. Time feels trapped there. And that's where the movie becomes genuinely unsettling, because the house itself almost functions like preserved grief. Not haunted in the paranormal sense at first, haunted psychologically. Claire begins organizing old belongings while preparing the property for sale, and the movie smartly grounds itself in realistic behavior. She's not instantly terrified. She's exhausted, numb, distracted. There's an authenticity to how adults process trauma here. She spends nights drinking wine alone while sorting through family photographs. She ignores calls from her ex-boyfriend Evan because she clearly doesn't have the emotional energy to explain herself to anybody. She barely sleeps. The film lingers on these mundane routines because it wants the audience emotionally locked into her isolation before introducing anything overtly disturbing. One of the strongest early sequences happens during the second night in the house. Claire hears movement upstairs around 3 a.m. and assumes it's probably pipes expanding from the cold, or maybe raccoons inside the attic. The film never pushes her into stereotypical horror movie stupidity. She reacts like a real person, irritated, more than frightened. She grabs a flashlight, checks the hallway, finds nothing, and goes back downstairs. But while she's sitting in the kitchen afterward, the camera stays fixed on her face as another sound echoes faintly above her. This time, she doesn't move immediately. She just listens. That hesitation tells you everything about her mental state. Part of her is scared. Another part almost wants something to be there. That emotional contradiction becomes the engine driving the entire story. Over the next several days, the movie slowly introduces details suggesting Claire's memories about Daniel's disappearance may not be reliable. She finds old journal entries describing arguments between them before his hiking trip. Their relationship apparently became strained after Daniel accused their mother of hiding family secrets related to their father's death years earlier. The script never dumps exposition all at once either. Information arrives naturally through objects, conversations, unfinished recordings. It feels investigative without becoming procedural. And honestly, the pacing here is going to divide audiences. This is not a movie interested in constant incident. Some scenes stretch deliberately long. There's a nearly 7-minute sequence where Claire simply watches old VHS tapes in silence while snow falls outside the living room windows. A mainstream studio probably would have cut half of that material. But the stillness matters because the film is less concerned with what happens next and more concerned with emotional accumulation. You're supposed to sit inside her discomfort. Then the hallucinations, or possible hallucinations, begin intensifying. Claire starts seeing Daniel briefly inside reflections. Not full-body ghost appearances, just fragmented glimpses. A figure standing behind her in mirrors. Somebody watching from outside the property line during heavy snowfall. The movie wisely keeps these moments ambiguous. They happen quickly enough that even the audience questions whether they actually saw anything. That ambiguity creates tension far more effectively than over-explained supernatural lore. There's one scene I genuinely haven't stopped thinking about since watching the film. Claire discovers an old cassette tape recorded by Daniel shortly before his disappearance. Most of the tape is ordinary conversation at first. Random thoughts, complaints about their mother, fragments of hiking plans. But midway through, his tone changes completely. He starts talking about something hidden beneath the house. He sounds paranoid, but not insane. Frightened, honestly. He keeps repeating that their mother knew about it for years. Now, in a weaker thriller, this would immediately become some giant mystery box plot device, but handles it differently. Claire doesn't suddenly launch into detective mode. She gets angry, emotionally defensive, because hearing Daniel speak this way forces her to reconsider whether she ignored warning signs before he vanished, and guilt becomes central to everything after that point. The movie gradually reveals Claire spent years distancing herself emotionally from her family because she viewed Daniel as unstable and attention-seeking. During flashbacks, we see him trying repeatedly to discuss strange things happening inside the house, while Claire dismisses him as paranoid. The film carefully avoids making either sibling completely right or completely wrong. That complexity helps enormously because real families rarely function through clean moral lines. As winter storms begin isolating the property physically, Claire's sense of reality starts deteriorating more aggressively. Power outages occur frequently. The house creaks constantly during freezing temperatures. Certain rooms trigger fragmented memories she cannot fully process. At one point, she wakes up on the basement floor without remembering how she got there. Another night, she hears Daniel's voice through heating vents calling her name softly. And the movie does something smart here. It never rushes to confirm supernatural explanations. Everything remains psychologically plausible. Trauma, sleep deprivation, alcohol, grief-induced dissociation. The script keeps every interpretation open simultaneously, which makes the tension feel intellectually engaging instead of mechanically scary. There's also a fascinating side character named Martin, an older neighbor living several properties away, who occasionally checks on Claire during storms. In another movie, he'd probably become some exposition delivery machine, revealing dark secrets about the house. Here, he's written much more subtly, lonely, slightly uncomfortable socially, deeply observant. He speaks carefully around Claire, almost like he knows more than he wants to admit. Their conversations become some of the film's strongest scenes because they feel rooted in emotional realism rather than thriller plotting. At one point, Martin tells her something that completely reframes the movie's themes. He says, "Some people confuse hiding with healing. Houses are good at helping you do that." That line lands hard because it explains Claire's entire emotional condition without sounding artificially philosophical. The title starts evolving again. Shelter from weather, shelter from grief, shelter from truth, but also imprisonment, disguised as safety. And visually, the film keeps reinforcing emotional claustrophobia. As Claire's mental state worsens, the camera framing becomes tighter. Hallways feel narrower. Windows appear almost oppressive during nighttime scenes. The production design deserves serious credit because the house never transforms into some exaggerated horror environment. It remains believable throughout. That realism makes every disturbing detail more effective. Then comes the sequence that completely shifts the movie into darker territory. During a severe blizzard, Claire loses electricity for nearly an entire night. She lights candles throughout the house and eventually falls asleep in the living room. Sometime after midnight, she wakes up, hearing somebody walking slowly upstairs. Not random creaking, actual footsteps, distinct, measured, heavy enough that she can identify movement from room to room. And this scene is terrifying precisely because the film refuses sensationalism. No loud music, no rapid editing. Just Claire standing motionless at the bottom of the staircase, listening to footsteps continue above her, while darkness swallows nearly the entire second floor. The sound eventually stops outside Daniel's old bedroom. She walks upstairs. The door is slightly open. Inside, the room looks different than before. Not destroyed, not supernatural. Rearranged. Small objects have been moved exactly the way Daniel used to keep them years earlier. And sitting on the bed is a photograph Claire has never seen before. A picture of her and Daniel as children standing beside a storm shelter behind the house. A structure she has absolutely no memory of existing. That's the moment the movie quietly changes from psychological grief drama into something much stranger and more dangerous, because now Claire has to confront the possibility that either someone is manipulating her inside the house, or her own mind has buried entire sections of her childhood for a reason. What makes the next stretch of so effective is that it refuses to answer the question too quickly. A lot of thrillers panic once they've established mystery because they're afraid audiences will lose patience, so they start dumping explanations everywhere. This movie does the opposite. It tightens emotionally instead of widening narratively. The deeper Claire digs into her memories, the less certain she becomes about who she even was inside this family before she left town years ago. And honestly, the movie's smartest decision might be how it treats memory itself, almost like contaminated evidence. Claire becomes obsessed with the photograph of the storm shelter. She studies every detail, trying to force recognition from her subconscious. There's snow in the background of the image. Daniel looks around 8 years old. Claire maybe 12. Their mother is partially visible near the edge of the frame, but somebody has scratched her face aggressively with what looks like a key or knife. The photograph feels violated, angry, personal. The next morning, Claire searches the property behind the house expecting to find nothing, because logically, she believes she would remember a structure like that. But after hiking through dense overgrown trees behind the backyard fence line, she eventually discovers a rusted metal hatch, buried beneath collapsed branches and years of dead leaves. And the way the film shoots this discovery is incredible because there's no dramatic reveal music, no giant orchestral cue telling the audience something important has happened. The camera simply holds on Claire's face while realization spreads slowly across her expression. Not fear at first, betrayal. That emotional detail matters because suddenly the terrifying thing isn't that the shelter exists, it's that her mind erased it. She spends nearly an hour trying to force the hatch open before finally managing to break the rusted lock using tools from the garage. Underneath is a narrow concrete staircase descending into darkness. The shelter itself turns out to be an old Cold War era bunker, apparently built by Claire's father decades earlier. Small, cramped, barely large enough for 4 people comfortably. Dust covers almost everything inside except for one area near the back wall that looks recently disturbed. Again, the movie's restraint really stands out here. Most directors would immediately throw some horrifying visual at the audience the second Claire enters the bunker. Instead, the tension comes from ordinary objects. Old canned food, water-stained blankets, emergency radios, family board games stacked in one corner. The realization slowly dawns on Claire that her parents used this place regularly during her childhood, and she remembers none of it. The implications become emotionally devastating because buried memory is always scarier when it involves ordinary domestic life instead of sensational abuse movie cliches. The bunker suggests years of hidden behavior inside this family that Claire's mind completely disconnected from. Then she finds the recordings. Dozens of mini cassette tapes stored inside waterproof containers, all labeled carefully by date. Her father's voice fills the bunker for the first time, and this is where the movie suddenly gains another emotional layer entirely, because the father, despite being dead for over 15 years, becomes one of the most haunting presences in the film without ever physically appearing outside fragmented flashbacks. Through the recordings, we learn he was deeply paranoid during the later years of his life, not violently unstable, not cartoonishly insane, just consumed by the belief that something dangerous existed inside the house. He repeatedly describes hearing voices through the walls late at night. He talks about protecting the family during storms. He becomes obsessed with the idea that the shelter is the only safe place on the property. At first, Claire interprets this exactly how most viewers probably would: untreated mental illness. But then details stop lining up cleanly. One tape contains an argument between her parents recorded accidentally in the background. Her mother sounds terrified, not dismissive. She keeps insisting they should leave the house permanently, while the father argues they can't let it follow them again. The wording is vague enough to remain ambiguous, but emotionally, the scene hits hard, because now the possibility emerges that Claire inherited fragmented trauma from both parents without understanding its source. And honestly, the movie deserves credit for how maturely it handles generational fear. Too many psychological thrillers simplify trauma into neat symbolic metaphors. Understand something messier. Families often pass fear down indirectly through behavior, long before children understand the reason behind it. Claire starts spending increasing amounts of time inside the bunker, listening to tapes, almost compulsively. The outside world begins fading from importance. She ignores phone calls, stops answering messages from work entirely. Even her physical appearance subtly changes as the film progresses. Darker circles under her eyes, less sleep, colder emotional reactions. The movie never announces these details loudly. It trusts the audience to notice deterioration gradually. Then there's the dream sequence. And I normally hate explaining dream sequences in movies because they're often lazy shortcuts, pretending to be depth. But this one genuinely unsettled me because it feels emotionally coherent rather than random. Claire dreams she's a child again, sitting inside the bunker during a thunderstorm, while her parents argue upstairs in muffled voices. Daniel is beside her, holding a flashlight under his chin, trying to make her laugh. Suddenly, the shelter door above them slams violently shut. The lights go out. Daniel whispers, "Don't let it hear you." That line by itself wouldn't mean much in another film. Here it lands differently because the movie has conditioned you into understanding how memory and fear contaminate each other. Claire wakes up inside the bunker in complete darkness after apparently falling asleep there overnight. And for the first time in the movie, she experiences genuine panic, not atmospheric discomfort, full panic, breathing hard, disoriented. She scrambles toward the stairs, only to discover the hatch above her won't open immediately. Now, rationally, there are multiple explanations. Rust, frozen hinges, shifted debris outside. But emotionally, Claire spirals instantly because buried childhood fear is suddenly colliding with adult consciousness. When she finally escapes back outside, daylight feels almost alien. The film shoots the snowy forest around the property with this washed-out emptiness that makes reality itself seem emotionally drained. Claire stands there shaking, staring at the house from a distance, like she no longer recognizes it as home. And this is where the movie subtly shifts again. The horror stops feeling contained inside the property. It starts infecting Claire psychologically, everywhere she goes. There's an incredible grocery store scene shortly afterward where she suddenly hears Daniel calling her name through overhead speakers while shopping. Nobody else reacts. The sound fades almost immediately, but the scene works because it happens in bright public space rather than darkness. The movie understands real psychological deterioration becomes terrifying when ordinary environments stop feeling stable. Meanwhile, Martin grows increasingly concerned about her isolation. He notices lights inside the bunker at night from his property and confronts Claire carefully about it. Their conversation on his porch during heavy snowfall might honestly be the emotional centerpiece of the entire film, because Martin finally reveals he knew Claire's father personally. Not well, but enough. He describes him as a decent man, destroyed slowly by fear. According to Martin, Claire's father became convinced something traumatic happened inside the house, years before the family moved there. Something involving the previous owners. But Martin admits nobody in town ever understood exactly what he believed. Then Martin says something extremely important. He tells Claire her father stopped trusting his own memories near the end of his life. That line changes everything. Because now the audience starts questioning whether the movie is actually about supernatural evil at all, or whether this family has been trapped for generations inside inherited psychological collapse. And the film never forces an answer. That ambiguity becomes addictive. Claire eventually discovers one final tape recorded by Daniel just days before his disappearance. Unlike the others, this one sounds different immediately. His voice is calmer, focused, resigned almost. He says he finally understands why their father was afraid. He says the shelter isn't there to protect the family from something outside. It's there to keep something inside. And the movie cuts to silence after that line. No explanation, no immediate reveal. Just Claire sitting alone inside the dark bunker, realizing her brother may have vanished, while trying to uncover truths their entire family spent decades psychologically avoiding. That's when the movie really starts crawling under your skin, because the central fear no longer feels physical. It feels hereditary. By the time it reaches its middle stretch, the atmosphere becomes almost suffocating because the film has completely abandoned the comforting idea that there's a clean explanation waiting at the end. That's the point where a lot of viewers are either going to fully lock into the movie emotionally or start resisting it altogether. The film asks for patience in a way modern thrillers rarely do anymore. It doesn't hand you certainty. It keeps peeling away emotional defenses instead. Claire starts researching the previous owners of the property, after listening to Daniel's final recording repeatedly, not obsessively in a conspiracy thriller way with giant evidence boards and frantic detective scenes. More quietly destructive than that. Sleepless internet searches at 4 a.m, old newspaper archives, county property records. The movie grounds everything in believable behavior, which keeps the emotional realism intact even as events become stranger. She discovers the house originally belonged to a family named the Whitakers during the late 1970s, a husband, wife, and young daughter. According to archived local reports, the father disappeared during a severe winter storm and was never located. The wife later claimed he had become paranoid in the months before vanishing, insisting there were voices beneath the house. Eventually, she relocated with her daughter, and the property remained vacant for years before Claire's parents purchased it. Now, what's interesting is how the movie handles this information. A lesser script would turn the discovery into proof of supernatural activity, but deliberately keeps the parallels psychologically interpretable. Two fathers, same house, same fear, same deterioration. The audience is left wondering whether the property itself is dangerous or whether damaged people simply imprint their fear onto isolated spaces until paranoia becomes contagious. That uncertainty becomes even more disturbing because Claire herself starts repeating behavioral patterns from both her father and Daniel without realizing it. She begins recording audio notes obsessively around the house at night. She stops sleeping upstairs entirely. She keeps checking locks repeatedly. There's a subtle scene where she catches herself listening to silence inside the walls for nearly 2 full minutes before suddenly realizing what she's doing. The horror there isn't external, it's inheritance. She's becoming someone she spent her entire adult life trying not to become. And the movie understands how terrifying self-recognition can be. One night during another power outage, Claire hears what sounds like somebody speaking softly inside the heating vents again. This time, the voice isn't Daniel's. It sounds older, male, barely audible. The film smartly refuses subtitles because it wants viewers leaning into the discomfort. Claire follows the sound through the dark hallway carrying only a flashlight, eventually tracing it toward a sealed section of basement wall behind old shelving units. Now, this sequence could have turned into conventional horror very easily. Instead, it becomes emotionally horrifying. Because after tearing through damaged drywall in panic, Claire discovers dozens of hidden cassette recordings stored inside the wall cavity. Recordings made by her mother. And suddenly, the entire emotional architecture of the movie shifts again. Until this point, Claire's mother existed mostly as a distant figure, associated with emotional coldness and silence. Through these tapes, though, we realize she may have been carrying the heaviest psychological burden of anybody in the family. Her recordings aren't dramatic confessions. They sound exhausted, intimate, private. She speaks softly, like somebody terrified another person might overhear her. She talks about Claire sleepwalking as a child. She talks about Daniel hearing voices through the floorboards. She repeatedly mentions episodes involving Claire's father during storms. Then comes the detail that changes the emotional meaning of everything. Her mother admits they used the bunker not because they believed something was outside the house, but because Claire's father became violent during dissociative episodes. The film drops this revelation with devastating restraint. No dramatic score. No flashback montage. Just Claire sitting frozen in darkness, listening to her mother quietly describe barricading herself and the children inside the shelter, while her father wandered the house upstairs in paranoid confusion. And suddenly years of fragmented imagery rearranged themselves in Claire's mind. The fear, the erased memories, the bunker, the arguments, Daniel's obsession. It all stops feeling supernatural for a moment and becomes painfully human. Mental illness, trauma, family terror buried under silence for decades. Honestly, this is where the screenplay becomes much more emotionally intelligent than most modern psychological thrillers because it refuses simplistic villainy. Claire's father isn't portrayed as some monstrous abuser archetype. Through the recordings, he sounds frightened of himself. A man psychologically collapsing while desperately trying to protect his family from what he believed he might become during episodes he no longer fully controlled. That complexity matters because it prevents the movie from turning trauma into entertainment shorthand. Claire completely unravels after hearing the tapes, not explosively, quietly. She spends nearly an entire day sitting inside the bunker, unable to process the realization that huge portions of her childhood were psychologically buried for survival. The film gives these scenes room to breathe too. Long silences, minimal dialogue. You feel the weight of memory reassembling itself inside her, piece by piece. And then the movie introduces its most disturbing idea. What if Daniel discovered the truth before Claire did, and couldn't survive carrying it alone? That possibility hangs over every remaining scene like emotional poison. Claire revisits old hiking maps connected to Daniel's disappearance and notices something strange. The route where he vanished leads directly into the mountains surrounding their property line. Not random wilderness, familiar territory. She starts suspecting Daniel never intended to go on a casual hiking trip at all. He was searching for something connected to the family history. During this stretch, the winter weather outside becomes almost oppressive. Snowstorms isolate the property completely. Roads close. Cell service weakens. But again, the film never turns this into survival thriller spectacle. The environment reflects Claire's psychological imprisonment more than physical danger. There's one sequence in particular that absolutely wrecked me emotionally. Claire watches an old home video recorded during Christmas when she and Daniel were children. At first, the footage feels warm and ordinary. Their father is laughing. Their mother looks relaxed. Daniel keeps trying to pull Claire toward the camera, joking around like little brothers do. For a few minutes, the family actually appears happy. Then the father suddenly freezes mid-conversation after hearing something off-screen. The room changes instantly, not through horror music, through behavior. His expression empties completely. Their mother becomes visibly tense. Daniel stops smiling. Even young Claire looks afraid without understanding why. The father quietly tells everyone to go downstairs. The tape cuts there. That moment is terrifying because it shows trauma infecting ordinary life without warning. 1 second warmth, next second fear. Families living around instability often function exactly like that emotionally. The movie captures it with painful accuracy. Claire eventually confronts her mother at the assisted care facility despite doctors' warning that stress could worsen her condition. And this scene might honestly be the best acting in the entire film, because it avoids melodrama entirely. Claire doesn't scream accusations. She sounds broken, confused, desperate for coherence. Her mother, physically fragile and struggling cognitively after the stroke, initially denies remembering much. But when Claire mentions the shelter, her entire demeanor changes. Fear returns instantly despite her condition. Then she says the line that completely reframes the title one final time. We built it because love can become dangerous when fear lives inside it long enough. That sentence explains the entire emotional tragedy of the family. The shelter wasn't protection from monsters. It was protection from each other. And suddenly, every haunting element in the movie starts feeling psychologically recontextualized. The voices, the paranoia, the inherited fear. Even Daniel's disappearance becomes less about mystery and more about a family destroyed slowly by untreated trauma, passed between generations like infection. But the film still refuses to fully close the supernatural door. Because when Claire returns home that night, she finds fresh footprints in the snow leading from the forest directly toward the bunker hatch. Only one set, barefoot, and stopping inches before the entrance like somebody stood there for a long time watching the house in silence. That image stays with you because the movie understands how to weaponize uncertainty without overplaying it. Bare footprints in snow shouldn't feel terrifying on paper, but inside the emotional context of man, they become deeply unnerving because Claire and the audience can no longer confidently separate psychological deterioration from external reality. And honestly, the film becomes much scarier after the family trauma revelations, because now every strange event carries dual interpretations simultaneously. If something impossible happens, is it truly happening? Is Claire unconsciously recreating inherited patterns? Is the house psychologically influencing vulnerable people? Or has the family spent decades rationalizing away something genuinely abnormal because reality was easier to survive than the alternative? The movie never chooses one lane cleanly. That's exactly why it works. Claire follows the footprints into the woods despite clearly knowing it's irrational, and the direction of this scene says everything about the movie's priorities. There's no dramatic chase energy, no sudden action thriller pacing. She moves slowly through heavy snowfall, carrying only a flashlight, while daylight fades into this cold blue-gray dusk. The forest surrounding the property starts feeling endless, silent, except for distant wind and branches creaking under ice. Then she finds Daniel's backpack, half buried beneath snow near an abandoned ranger trail, not damaged by weather the way it realistically should be after months missing, almost preserved. Inside are ordinary items at first: flashlight batteries, notebooks, maps, protein bars, but buried underneath everything else is another cassette recorder. Claire plays it immediately while standing there in the freezing woods, and Daniel's voice sounds calmer than ever before. Too calm, honestly. The kind of calm people sometimes reach after emotional exhaustion strips away panic entirely. He says he finally remembered what happened the night their father died. And suddenly, the entire emotional center of the film shifts again. Up until now, Claire believed her father died from suicide after years of psychological decline. That's the family narrative she carried into adulthood. But Daniel's recording suggests something else entirely happened inside that house during the final storm before his death. The tape cuts in and out because of damage, but certain details come through clearly enough to devastate Claire emotionally. Daniel remembers their father locking himself inside the bunker during one of his dissociative episodes, while their mother tried keeping the children upstairs. At some point during the storm, young Claire apparently went missing inside the house. Their father found her wandering outside near the forest line in severe weather with no memory of leaving. And according to Daniel, their father became convinced something in the house had been calling her. Now rationally, there are countless psychological explanations: sleepwalking, childhood dissociation, parental paranoia, contaminating memory. But the movie presents these details through emotional perspective rather than objective truth. That distinction matters enormously because the audience experiences events exactly how Claire experiences them: fragmented, uncertain, emotionally unstable. Daniel's recording ends with one final statement that hit me harder than almost any line in the movie. He says, "I don't think Dad was protecting us from the house. I think he was protecting the house from what happened to us inside it." That line completely inverts the emotional meaning of the story, because suddenly the house stops feeling like the source of trauma and starts feeling more like a container holding decades of unresolved damage, fear, violence, silence, grief, and inherited instability. Claire returns home emotionally shattered, and from this point forward, the movie enters almost dreamlike territory without fully abandoning realism. Time starts feeling unstable. Scenes flow together strangely. She falls asleep unintentionally and wakes hours later in different rooms. Snowstorms outside become so intense, the world beyond the property barely seems to exist anymore. And visually, the film becomes gorgeous in a bleak way. The cinematography during this final stretch feels almost ghostly. Snow, reflecting pale light through windows. Candlelit rooms swallowed by darkness. Long static shots, where Claire appears tiny against empty spaces inside the house. There's one image of her standing motionless at the top of the staircase, while the entire first floor below sits black and silent, that honestly feels like a painting more than a movie frame. The sound design becomes increasingly important too. The house constantly breathes around her now. Pipes groaning, floorboards shifting, faint distant knocking, sometimes voices, sometimes only wind. The audience stops knowing which sounds are real alongside Claire. Then comes the dinner table sequence, and this is where the film quietly reaches another emotional level entirely. Claire prepares dinner one night almost automatically, like muscle memory taking over. She sets plates around the table without thinking. 4 plates. 1 for herself, 1 for Daniel, 1 for her mother, 1 for her father. When she realizes what she's done, she just stands there, staring at the table, while tears start forming. No dramatic breakdown, no screaming, just overwhelming exhaustion, crashing into awareness all at once. That moment destroyed me more than any horror scene because it captures grief with terrifying honesty. Trauma doesn't always arrive through dramatic explosions. Sometimes it's realizing your body still remembers routines connected to people who are gone. The movie understands that kind of pain deeply. Later that night, Claire finally accesses a buried childhood memory while sitting inside the bunker during another storm. And the scene is extraordinary because the film never visually confirms whether we're watching objective flashback or reconstructed memory. Young Claire hears her parents arguing upstairs. Her father sounds terrified, insisting the family needs to leave permanently. Her mother refuses because she believes running away will only worsen his condition. Then Daniel sneaks upstairs alone. Moments later, screaming erupts. The memory fractures there. Claire suddenly remembers blood on the kitchen floor, her father collapsing near the staircase, her mother crying, Daniel standing frozen in shock, and little Claire herself clutching a fireplace poker without understanding why. The film cuts back to present-day Claire gasping for breath inside the bunker, realizing the possibility she accidentally caused her father's death during childhood chaos. Her mind spent decades suppressing. Now this revelation could have become melodramatic very easily in another movie, but handles it with painful restraint. The horror isn't twist-reveal shock. The horror is watching Claire's entire identity collapse under the weight of recovered memory she cannot emotionally survive. And still, the movie refuses certainty. Because immediately after this realization, Claire hears movement upstairs inside the house again. Distinct footsteps. Slow. Measured. Exactly like before. She leaves the bunker trembling and walks back toward the house through heavy snowfall. Every light inside the home is now glowing despite the power supposedly being dead for hours. The front door hangs slightly open. Inside, warmth fills the air unnaturally. The dinner table is fully set now. Not 4 plates anymore. 5. And sitting at the far end of the table, partially obscured by darkness, is a figure Claire initially believes is Daniel. But when the figure slowly raises its head, the face belongs to her father. Not decayed, not monstrous, just staring at her with exhausted sadness. And the movie does something incredibly brave here. No jump scare happens, no attack, no violent reveal. Her father simply says, "You were never supposed to remember." That moment works because the film has spent so long conditioning the audience emotionally that even impossible imagery feels tragic instead of sensational. Whether this is supernatural reality, psychotic breakdown, trauma hallucination, or symbolic memory reconstruction, almost stops mattering entirely. Emotionally, it's real to Claire, and that's what the movie ultimately cares about most. The final act becomes almost hypnotic, because by that point, the movie no longer behaves according to normal thriller expectations. It's operating emotionally rather than mechanically. Cause and effect still exist, technically, but the deeper Claire falls into buried memory, the more the film starts feeling like somebody wandering through emotional ruins, trying to distinguish truth from survival instinct. And honestly, I think this is where a lot of audiences are going to split hard. Some viewers are going to desperately want definitive answers. Others are going to appreciate that the movie trusts ambiguity enough to let emotion become the resolution instead of plot explanation. Personally, I think the ambiguity is exactly what gives the ending its power, because certainty would actually cheapen everything the film spent 2 hours building psychologically. After seeing the figure at the dinner table, Claire doesn't run. That detail matters. Earlier in the film, she still believed fear could be escaped physically. Leave the room. Leave the house. Avoid the memory. But by this stage, she understands the real terror has always been internal. So instead of fleeing, she slowly sits down across from the figure wearing her father's face. The cinematography during this sequence is unbelievable. Almost no camera movement. Warm amber lighting from candles. Snow falling outside the windows behind them. The father figure barely moves at all while speaking, which somehow makes the scene more disturbing than any monstrous performance could have. He asks Claire whether she remembers the storm. Not a storm. The storm. Like the family spent years treating one specific night as emotional ground zero without ever naming it directly. Claire begins piecing fragments together aloud, while the film cuts intermittently between present time and distorted flashes of memory. Her father's worsening paranoia, Daniel trying to protect her as children, their mother hiding bruises, the bunker becoming routine during emotional episodes, years of fear normalized slowly enough that nobody inside the family understood, how damaged they'd become. And then the movie finally reveals what likely happened the night the father died. During one of his dissociative breaks, he apparently became convinced Claire was in danger from something inside the house. Young Claire woke during the storm and wandered downstairs while her parents argued violently. Daniel tried stopping their father from approaching her because he was behaving erratically. In the chaos, Claire grabbed the fireplace poker in fear after seeing her father lunge toward Daniel. The memory cuts before impact. Again, the film refuses objective confirmation. But emotionally, Claire now believes she killed him accidentally as a child while trying to protect her brother, and that guilt explains everything afterward. The repression, the buried memories, Daniel's obsession with uncovering the truth, her mother's silence, the emotional poison infecting every corner of the house for decades. What's heartbreaking is that the father figure never accuses her. If anything, he sounds mournful, exhausted, like the manifestation itself is built from Claire's guilt more than literal haunting. He tells her something that completely reframes the emotional tragedy of the entire family. Fear kept us alive so long, it forgot how to let us live. That line hit me like a truck, because suddenly the movie's central idea crystallizes perfectly. Every member of this family built emotional shelters to survive trauma, denial, silence, paranoia, emotional distance. But eventually, those coping mechanisms became prisons themselves. Claire finally asks the question hanging over the entire film. What happened to Daniel? And the movie answers in the most devastating way possible. The father figure simply looks toward the bunker outside. No dialogue, just silence. Claire walks through the snow toward the shelter one final time while the storm intensifies around her. The sound design here is extraordinary because the wind almost swallows reality completely. You can barely hear her footsteps. The world feels erased down to pure isolation. Inside the bunker, she discovers something hidden beneath loose floor panels near the back wall. Daniel's final journals. And this is where the movie quietly breaks your heart. Because the journals reveal Daniel remembered the truth years earlier than Claire did. He spent most of his adult life trying to reconcile childhood love for his family with memories too painful to process fully. He became obsessed with the house, not because he believed it was evil, but because he thought understanding the truth might finally free Claire from repression. There's one passage that honestly wrecked me emotionally. Daniel writes that Claire was never dangerous, just frightened, and everybody around her was too damaged themselves to help her carry what happened. That line changes the emotional meaning of her entire character. Claire spent her adult life terrified something was fundamentally wrong inside her, without understanding that trauma itself was the wound. The journals also strongly imply Daniel intentionally disappeared. Not suicide exactly, more like surrender. He believed the family history had consumed all of them psychologically and couldn't imagine surviving the weight of inherited fear anymore. The movie never explicitly states whether he died in the mountains, froze during the storm, or simply vanished permanently by choice. And honestly, leaving that unresolved feels right. Some losses remain incomplete forever. Claire spends hours inside the bunker reading his journals while the storm outside grows worse. The film becomes almost meditative here. Long silences, flickering lantern light, snow hitting metal overhead. It's less about suspense now and more about emotional excavation. Then something extraordinary happens. Not horrifying, extraordinary. Claire finally remembers a buried detail from childhood the repression hid completely. After the night of her father's death, her mother told both children they would survive only if they stopped talking about what happened. not maliciously, desperately. She believed silence could protect them from collapsing emotionally. The bunker became symbolic afterward, a place where truth was hidden away so the family could continue functioning. That realization transforms the title one last time. Shelter was never safety, it was avoidance. And avoidance became generational inheritance. The final scenes of the movie are unbelievably restrained for modern Hollywood. No massive confrontation, no giant supernatural explanation, no explosive climax. Claire simply walks out of the bunker at dawn after the storm finally passes. The world outside looks transformed, not magically, just quiet, still. The snowstorm has ended, and sunlight touches the property for the first time in what feels like the entire movie. Claire stands staring at the house while Daniel's final journal narration plays softly over the scene. He says memories don't disappear when buried. They wait. And if people never face them honestly, they reshape entire lives from underneath. Claire walks back inside the house one final time. She opens every curtain, every window, every locked room. The film lingers on this process deliberately because symbolically, she's dismantling the emotional architecture of repression piece by piece. Then she enters the dining room. The extra fifth plate is gone now. The house is silent. Ordinary again. Or maybe it always was. That ambiguity remains until the final frame. Claire gathers the family photographs, Daniel's tapes, the journals, and her mother's recordings into cardboard boxes near the front door. The implication is clear. She's no longer hiding from what happened. She's carrying it openly now instead. And right before leaving, she notices one final detail. Fresh footprints leading away from the bunker toward the forest line. Only one set, barefoot, the same as before. This time, though, she doesn't follow them. She just watches quietly, almost peacefully. The movie ends there. No final jump scare, no confirmation, no answer about whether something supernatural ever truly existed around the family. Because ultimately the film understands the literal explanation was never the point. The real horror was what silence did to people who loved each other, but didn't know how to survive pain, honestly. And what stayed with me long after the credits rolled wasn't the mystery. It was the sadness. The overwhelming sadness of watching an entire family spend decades building emotional shelters around trauma until none of them remembered how to live outside them anymore. One thing that's really important to understand about the release of is that this wasn't positioned like a typical mainstream horror launch at all. The studio clearly understood they weren't selling a jump scare movie designed for opening weekend teenagers looking for loud theater reactions. The marketing campaign leaned heavily into mood, psychological tension, and emotional ambiguity from the beginning, which honestly was probably the smartest possible decision. Because if audiences walked into this expecting non-stop supernatural chaos, they were going to experience severe tonal whiplash. The film premiered quietly during the late fall festival circuit before getting a wider North American release in early February, and that timing actually tells you a lot about how the distributors viewed the project. February has become a weirdly interesting month for adult thrillers over the past decade. It's no longer just a dumping ground for weak studio leftovers. Mid-budget psychological films increasingly land there because studios know audiences during that period are more open to atmospheric genre stories that rely on word of mouth rather than giant blockbuster momentum, and honestly feels very intentionally mid-budget in the best possible way. Not cheap, focused. There's a difference. The movie doesn't waste money pretending to be larger than it is. Almost the entire story unfolds across limited locations. The house, the bunker, surrounding woods, small town interiors. But instead of feeling visually repetitive, that contains scale becomes emotionally claustrophobic. You can tell the filmmakers prioritize performance, cinematography, and sound design over spectacle-heavy sequences. That's becoming increasingly rare in studio-backed psychological thrillers because Hollywood spent years convincing itself audiences only show up for horror if trailers promise non-stop sensory assault. But lately, there's been this gradual shift happening. Viewers seem exhausted by algorithmic horror filmmaking. Everything became too optimized for reaction clips and opening night social media moments. Loud sting, sudden face, violent sound cue, repeat every 7 minutes. And eventually, audiences started craving slower tension again. You can actually trace a pretty clear line over the last several years, showing renewed appreciation for atmospheric psychological storytelling, where fear grows from emotional instability rather than pure spectacle, arrived directly inside that cultural moment. What's fascinating, though, is that the film doesn't fully resemble the modern elevated horror movement either. It shares DNA with that era emotionally: grief, trauma, family collapse, psychological deterioration, but stylistically, it feels older, more patient, less interested in announcing its symbolism constantly. The movie trusts viewers enough to sit with silence and ambiguity without aggressively underlining every metaphor in red marker. And that patience absolutely influenced how critics responded. Early reviews were sharply divided at first, which honestly felt inevitable. Some critics praised the film's restraint and emotional intelligence, especially the performances, and refusal to over-explain its central mystery. Others found the pacing frustratingly deliberate and criticized the ambiguity as emotionally withholding. But what's interesting is how audience reactions evolved over time after release. The people who connected with the movie really connected with it. Not in a fandom franchise way, in a deeply personal way. Discussions online started focusing less on what was real and more on interpretations of family trauma, inherited fear, dissociation, grief memory, and emotional repression. That's usually the sign of a psychological film successfully embedding itself into viewers emotionally instead of functioning as disposable content people forget by next weekend. I also think the release timing benefited from broader industry fatigue surrounding gigantic franchise storytelling. Audiences are still showing up for event films, obviously, but there's growing appreciation for contained adult dramas again, especially ones willing to blend genre elements with emotional realism. For years, Hollywood almost abandoned mid-budget psychological filmmaking because studios became obsessed with either ultra-cheap horror or gigantic cinematic universes. Movies operating in this emotional middle space became endangered for a while. That's why it feels refreshing industry-wise, even beyond its story itself. It reminds you there's still room for intimate adult thrillers driven by performance and atmosphere instead of intellectual property branding. And the production background makes that even more interesting. The director apparently spent years trying to get the project financed because studios repeatedly pushed for heavier supernatural elements and more conventional horror payoffs. According to several interviews, early script drafts contained far more explicit paranormal explanations, but the final version intentionally stripped most of that material away. Honestly, you can feel that discipline on screen. The movie becomes stronger precisely because it resists certainty. That restraint extends into the cinematography too, which feels heavily influenced by naturalistic 1970s paranoia thrillers and early 2000s psychological dramas rather than modern digital horror aesthetics. The visual approach avoids hyper-stylized nightmare imagery most of the time. Even disturbing moments are framed realistically. That grounded texture makes emotional scenes hit harder because the world feels physically believable. Another important industry detail: the film avoided overexposure before release. No endless trailers, no spoiler-heavy TV spots, no manufactured viral marketing gimmicks. The campaign stayed relatively controlled, which probably helped preserve the movie's psychological effect. Too many thrillers today reveal their entire emotional structure before audiences even buy tickets. Here, viewers entered theaters genuinely uncertain about what kind of film they were about to experience. And honestly, I miss that. There used to be something exciting about movies unfolding unpredictably instead of arriving pre-digested through marketing saturation. The cast interviews surrounding release were interesting too, because nearly everybody involved described the project less like horror and more like emotional drama disguised as genre cinema. The lead actress especially talked repeatedly about researching trauma memory, dissociation, and grief psychology, rather than traditional horror performance techniques. You can absolutely feel that preparation on screen because Claire never behaves like a stereotypical thriller protagonist. She reacts like somebody emotionally exhausted long before the scary events begin. That realism became one of the film's biggest talking points after release. A lot of viewers with personal experience around family trauma or emotionally unstable households connected deeply with the story's atmosphere, even when the plot remained ambiguous. The bunker metaphor especially generated tons of discussion because people interpreted it differently depending on their own experiences. Some saw it as repression. Others viewed it as inherited fear. Others interpreted it as emotional isolation passed down between generations. And the movie smartly allows all those readings simultaneously. One of the reasons the performances in work so well is because nobody approaches the material like they're acting inside a traditional horror movie. That distinction matters a lot. You can always feel when actors are performing genre emotions instead of behaving like emotionally exhausted human beings reacting to instability they barely understand themselves. Here, almost every major performance feels grounded in realism first and suspense second, which is exactly why the film becomes emotionally unsettling instead of simply scary. The entire movie rests on the shoulders of Claire's actress, and honestly, if that performance failed even slightly, the whole thing probably would have collapsed under the weight of its ambiguity. Size. A story, this psychologically internal, needs an actor capable of communicating emotional shifts without excessive dialogue, because the script spends huge stretches observing Claire alone. There are scenes where the camera stays on her face for uncomfortably long periods, while almost nothing happens externally, and somehow the performance still remains compelling, because you can literally watch thought processes changing underneath her silence. What impressed me most wasn't the breakdown scenes. Anybody can scream convincingly with the right music and editing. The difficult part is portraying slow emotional deterioration realistically over 2 hours without becoming repetitive or theatrical. Claire's actress handles that beautifully. Early in the movie, she feels emotionally detached in a very adult way, functioning mechanically, avoiding vulnerability, using routine to suppress grief. Then little behavioral fractures start appearing gradually. Longer pauses before answering questions, sudden emotional defensiveness, irritation masking fear. By the final act, she looks like somebody carrying physical weight inside her body. And the performance never begs for sympathy either. That restraint is important because the film trusts viewers enough to recognize pain without having it constantly announced. There's one small moment I keep thinking about where Claire absent-mindedly folds Daniel's old sweater while listening to one of his tapes. Nothing dramatic happens. No crying. No speech. But her hands suddenly stop moving for maybe 3 seconds after hearing his voice crack emotionally on the recording. That tiny hesitation communicates more grief than most movies achieve through giant monologues. That's difficult acting. Really difficult acting. The actor playing Daniel also deserves enormous credit because his entire presence in the film depends on emotional residue rather than screen time. Most of what we learn about him comes through recordings, flashbacks, home videos, and fragmented memory. Yet by the end of the movie, he feels emotionally vivid. You understand his loneliness, his frustration, his desperation to force the family into honesty, even when honesty threatened to destroy whatever fragile emotional stability remained. What I loved about Daniel's characterization is that the movie avoids romanticizing him into some perfect tragic figure. He clearly struggled psychologically himself. He became obsessive, emotionally isolated, fixated on uncovering buried truths to a potentially self-destructive degree. But the performance underneath all of that still feels deeply compassionate. You sense somebody trying desperately to save his sister emotionally, even while drowning himself. And honestly, that relationship between Claire and Daniel becomes the emotional core of the movie more than any horror element. Everything painful in the story grows from the fact that they loved each other deeply, but inherited emotional damage neither fully understood. The father is maybe the most fascinating character performance-wise because the movie constantly forces the audience to reinterpret him. Through early flashbacks and recordings, he initially seems frightening, unstable, paranoid, unpredictable. But as additional memories emerge, the performance gains tragic dimensions. The actor never plays the father like a monster. Even during scenes suggesting dissociative violence, there's fear underneath his behavior. Shame, exhaustion. He feels like a man terrified of his own mind, deteriorating, while still trying to protect his family from whatever he believes is happening inside him. That complexity saves the movie from becoming emotionally simplistic. Too many trauma-centered thrillers reduce damaged fathers into symbolic villains. Understands reality is often sadder and more complicated than that. Families can love each other deeply and still destroy each other unintentionally through untreated pain. The mother might actually be the film's most underrated performance, though, because she spends most of the movie existing at emotional distance, ill, fragmented, partially absent from active events. Yet every scene involving her carries enormous weight. The actress communicates years of buried fear through incredibly subtle choices, small hesitations, avoided eye contact, the way her voice changes whenever the shelter is mentioned. And then once the hidden recordings reveal what she endured inside the family dynamic, earlier scenes suddenly become heartbreaking retroactively. That's one of the film's greatest strengths overall. Performances gain new emotional meanings after later revelations without feeling manipulative. Martin, the older neighbor, could have easily become a cliché, mysterious local man character in another version of this story. But the performance keeps him grounded and painfully human, lonely, careful, slightly emotionally awkward. There's this feeling that he's spent years watching damaged people hurt themselves quietly from a distance without knowing how to intervene properly. His scenes with Claire are some of my favorites because they sound like actual adult conversations. Nobody speaks in exposition-heavy thriller dialogue. They circle around difficult truths indirectly the way emotionally guarded people often do in real life. One conversation especially stayed with me. Claire asks Martin why he never reported concerns about her father years earlier if he suspected something was wrong. And Martin responds with this exhausted honesty. Back then, people confused silence with respect. That line tells you everything about the emotional environment these characters grew up inside. The film's casting overall feels intentionally anti-Hollywood in a good way too. Nobody looks overly polished. The actors resemble real people carrying real exhaustion. Even during emotionally heightened scenes, performances remain physically grounded. Characters interrupt each other awkwardly. Conversations trail off. Long silences linger uncomfortably. That naturalism becomes essential because the movie asks audiences to emotionally believe impossible ambiguity. If the acting became even slightly theatrical, the entire atmosphere would collapse. Another thing I appreciated is how the film handles child performances during flashbacks. Hollywood child actors often speak like miniature adults delivering overly polished emotional dialogue. Here, the younger versions of Claire and Daniel feel messy and authentic. Their interactions during old home videos especially feel startlingly real, teasing each other, competing for attention, speaking over adults without realizing tension exists around them, which makes later revelations emotionally devastating, because those moments of ordinary childhood warmth feel genuine rather than manipulative setup. And honestly, the movie's strongest emotional trick might be how it gradually changes audience perception of every character without ever fully condemning or absolving anyone. By the end, nobody feels purely guilty or purely innocent. Everyone inside the family became both victim and participant in different ways. That emotional maturity is rare, especially in genre filmmaking. Even Claire herself becomes difficult to categorize cleanly by the final act. Early on, viewers instinctively sympathize with her as somebody haunted by external mystery. Later, the recovered memories force audiences to confront the possibility she accidentally caused catastrophic trauma as a child. But the film never weaponizes that revelation cruelly. It understands childhood fear, confusion, and repression aren't moral failures. They're survival responses. And the actress handles that emotional transition beautifully because Claire's growing self-awareness feels genuinely painful to watch. You can see the exact moment where self-protection collapses and grief finally arrives fully unfiltered. There's a scene near the ending where Claire rereads Daniel's journals while dawnlight enters the bunker for the first time, and her face alone carries almost the entire emotional conclusion of the film. Not dramatic devastation, something quieter, sadder. The look of somebody realizing they spent years afraid of becoming broken without understanding they were already carrying inherited fractures long before adulthood began. That emotional specificity elevates the entire movie, because ultimately isn't really about solving a mystery. It's about people trying to survive memories they were never emotionally equipped to hold. And every performance in the film understands that truth deeply enough to make the story feel painfully human, even when reality itself becomes uncertain. What I think separates from a lot of modern psychological thrillers is that it actually trusts silence. That sounds simple, but honestly, it's become surprisingly rare in contemporary filmmaking. Most movies today are terrified of stillness. Terrified audiences might stop paying attention for 5 seconds unless something explodes emotionally, visually, or narratively. This film moves the opposite direction. It slows down intentionally during moments where most directors would accelerate, and because of that, the tension starts feeling emotional instead of mechanical. And that's really the key to why the movie works for me. The fear doesn't come from what happens, it comes from what sits underneath what happens. There's this growing emotional suffocation throughout the film that almost sneaks up on you, because the movie spends so much time observing ordinary behavior contaminated by buried trauma. A woman walking through an empty hallway, somebody listening to old tapes late at night, snow falling outside a window while a house creaks softly in darkness. None of those things are inherently frightening, but the film builds emotional context around them so carefully that eventually normal life itself starts feeling haunted. That's difficult filmmaking. And honestly, I think audiences underestimate how hard subtle psychological horror actually is compared to loud horror. Anybody can startle viewers with editing tricks and sound spikes. Sustaining emotional unease for 2 hours without exhausting the audience takes real control. The cinematography deserves enormous praise for that. The camera rarely behaves aggressively. There aren't endless flashy movements announcing importance constantly. Instead, the visual language feels patient and observant. Static frames linger slightly longer than expected. Doorways divide compositions uncomfortably. Characters appear trapped inside rooms without the movie needing to verbally explain isolation. And the lighting choices throughout are incredible, especially during nighttime scenes. Modern thrillers often drown darkness in blue digital gloss, where everything still looks artificially visible for audience convenience. Allows darkness to remain genuinely oppressive. Corners disappear. Hallways feel endless. Sometimes Claire's flashlight barely illuminates anything at all. That realism creates vulnerability because the audience experiences uncertainty alongside her instead of observing safely from outside it. The sound design might honestly be the movie's secret weapon, though. Not because it's loud, because it's restrained. The house constantly produces tiny, unsettling noises. Heating vents, floorboards, distant metallic echoes, faint movement somewhere overhead. But the film never overuses them. Silence dominates long stretches, which means when sound finally intrudes, your nervous system reacts instinctively. There's one moment where Claire simply hears breathing through a vent while standing motionless in the kitchen. And I swear that scene disturbed me more than entire horror franchises filled with giant monsters, because breathing is intimate, human. It feels emotionally invasive. The score understands restraint too. Thank God the composers avoided the modern horror trend of punishing audiences with non-stop industrial screeching every 5 minutes. The music here functions more like emotional weather. Soft piano motifs, low ambient tones, long stretches where natural environmental sound completely replaces traditional scoring. And honestly, the movie becomes stronger every time it refuses to tell audiences exactly how to feel. That's something I deeply respect about it. Even thematically, the film avoids over-explaining itself. The bunker metaphor could have become embarrassingly obvious in weaker hands. Shelter as repression. Shelter as inherited silence. Shelter as emotional avoidance. Those ideas are clearly present, but the movie never pauses for a character speech explaining symbolism directly to the audience, like a literature teacher grading essays. It trusts viewers to connect emotional dots themselves. And I think that trust is why the movie lingers afterward. The ambiguity surrounding supernatural elements especially fascinated me because the film maintains incredible discipline all the way through. You can interpret almost everything psychologically if you want. The voices, the apparitions, the footsteps, the missing memory fragments, Claire's father appearing at the dinner table. All of it could theoretically emerge from trauma, repression, inherited paranoia, dissociation, and grief. But the movie never completely closes the door on something stranger either. Those footprints, the impossible details, the recurring voices, the way different family members across generations experience similar fears independently. The film leaves just enough uncertainty alive that the emotional tension never fully resolves intellectually. And personally, I think that's the correct artistic choice, because trauma itself often behaves like haunting. Families pass emotional damage between generations invisibly. Certain houses genuinely absorb memory psychologically. People normalize fear until entire environments feel contaminated emotionally even years later. The movie understands that human reality deeply enough that literal supernatural confirmation would almost feel unnecessary. Performance-wise, I honestly think Claire's actress delivers one of the strongest psychological thriller performances in recent years, because she never treats emotional collapse theatrically. The breakdown happens gradually and physically. Her posture changes over time. Eye contact becomes harder. Speech patterns slow down. She looks increasingly exhausted in ways makeup alone can't create. And importantly, the film allows her to remain difficult sometimes. Claire isn't written as endlessly sympathetic audience bait. She becomes obsessive, emotionally withdrawn, defensive, frustrating even. But that complexity makes her feel real. Trauma survivors often hurt people around them unintentionally while trying to survive their own internal chaos. Daniel's presence haunted me emotionally long after the movie ended too. Not because of mystery, because of sadness. The idea of somebody spending years trying to uncover buried family truth while slowly realizing the truth itself may destroy everyone emotionally once exposed. That's heartbreaking. His recordings gradually shifting from curiosity into exhausted resignation feels devastating by the end. And I think the movie's greatest accomplishment overall is that it never loses compassion for its characters. Even the father, especially the father. The easiest version of this story would have turned him into some monstrous abusive symbol. Instead, the film portrays somebody psychologically collapsing under fear he no longer understands or controls. That complexity transforms the entire emotional experience because viewers are forced to confront how damaged people can simultaneously love their families and traumatize them. Reality is messy like that. The movie understands messiness. Not everything resolves cleanly. Not every memory returns perfectly. Not every wound heals completely once acknowledged. And that final image of Claire choosing not to follow the footprints into the woods anymore, honestly, that might be my favorite ending detail in the entire film. Because for the first time, she stops chasing fear. Stops letting unresolved mystery consume her identity completely. Whether the footprints are supernatural, psychological, symbolic, or imaginary, almost stops mattering. The important thing is her decision not to disappear into inherited obsession the way Daniel and her father did before her. That's the emotional resolution. Not solving everything. Surviving honestly. And I think that's why hit me harder than I expected. Underneath the thriller structure, underneath the horror atmosphere, underneath all the ambiguity and memory fragmentation, the movie is really about something painfully human. The damage silence does inside families. The way fear reshapes love. How people bury truth, believing they're protecting each other, only to realize years later, the burial itself became the wound. That's heavy material for a psychological thriller, but the film earns it because it never feels exploitative. It approaches trauma with emotional maturity instead of sensationalism. And honestly, in an era where so many thrillers feel assembled by algorithms chasing attention spans, there's something refreshing about a movie willing to be quiet, patient, emotionally complicated, and genuinely sad. Not sad in a manipulative awards bait way. Sad in the real human sense. The kind of sadness that lingers after the credits because it reminds you how many people spend entire lifetimes building emotional shelters they eventually forget how to leave. What stayed with me most about isn't even a specific twist or reveal anymore. It's the way the film slowly trains you to rethink what safety even means in a human life. By the time you reach the end, the word shelter stops feeling like a physical structure and starts sounding more like a psychological reflex. Something people build without realizing they're also trapping themselves inside it. That idea is what makes the movie linger longer than most thrillers. Because once you sit with it for a while, you start noticing how every major character in the story built their own version of a shelter. Claire built emotional distance, a kind of quiet numbness where she could function without fully processing grief. Daniel built obsession, a belief that if he could just uncover the truth, everything would finally make sense and stabilize. Their father built paranoia, a constant state of hypervigilance that slowly detached him from shared reality. Their mother built silence, not out of cruelty, but survival, because speaking about pain seemed to make it worse instead of better. And the film is really just watching all those survival mechanisms collapse against each other inside one house. That's why the setting matters so much. The house isn't just a location. It becomes a psychological container where every coping mechanism collides and mutates over time. Even the bunker stops feeling like a place in the traditional sense. It becomes symbolic of generational avoidance, a physical space where truth is stored but never processed. And that's probably the most uncomfortable part of the film, if you think about it deeply. Nothing in the movie is truly supernatural in a confirmed sense, but nothing is fully explainable either. It lives in that uncomfortable middle space where psychology and possibility overlap. One of the final ideas the movie leaves you with is how memory itself is not stable. It's not a recording device. It's a reconstruction system. That's why Claire's experience feels so fractured. She isn't uncovering a clean timeline. She's rebuilding emotional truth from fragments that were never meant to be held consciously. And the film never judges her for that instability. If anything, it feels compassionate toward it, because the deeper implication is that her mind didn't fail her. It protected her the only way it knew how at the time. That's a subtle but important distinction. There's also something interesting about how the movie handles time. Most thrillers rely on time as escalation. Things get worse, faster, louder. But here, time feels circular. Emotional states repeat in slightly altered forms across generations. The father's paranoia echoes in Daniel's obsession. Daniel's obsession echoes in Claire's investigation. Even the mother's silence becomes a pattern Claire almost repeats when she isolates herself in the bunker. It's less about forward motion and more about emotional inheritance. That's a rare structural choice in mainstream psychological storytelling. And it's one of the reasons the movie feels more like a memory than a plot. Even the final visual language reinforces that idea. The snow, the house, the bunker, they all feel less like physical environments and more like emotional impressions. Like the movie is showing you how trauma feels when translated into space. Cold, isolated, repetitive, quietly overwhelming. There's also a kind of quiet tragedy in how the film treats truth itself. Because once Claire uncovers everything, at least as much as she's capable of uncovering, it doesn't actually fix anything in a clean narrative way. There's no emotional reset button, no full healing arc, no magical resolution where understanding the past suddenly makes the present easy. Instead, she's left with awareness. And awareness is not the same thing as peace. That's something most mainstream films avoid admitting. But this one doesn't. And maybe that's why the ending feels so honest. Claire doesn't become free in a dramatic sense. She just becomes conscious of what she's carrying. And she makes a choice to stop feeding the cycle of obsession that consumed her father and brother. That's the closest thing the movie offers to closure. Not escape, but interruption. And even the final shot, the footprints leading away into the forest, works more like a psychological echo than a literal clue. It's the past still existing, still pulling, still suggesting continuation. But Claire doesn't follow this time. That refusal feels small, but emotionally, it's huge. Because in families like this, breaking a pattern doesn't look like victory. It looks like restraint, quiet refusal, and walking away from inherited fear, even when it still exists. From a filmmaking standpoint, I think what really elevates is how consistent it is with its emotional philosophy. It never betrays its own tone just to satisfy genre expectations. It never suddenly becomes a different movie in the third act. It doesn't panic and add unnecessary exposition just to explain everything. That confidence is rare, especially in psychological thrillers, where studios often demand clarity at the expense of atmosphere. Here, ambiguity is not a weakness, it's the point. Because life doesn't always resolve neatly either. People don't always get full answers about their families. Memories don't always return cleanly. And trauma doesn't always present itself in a way that's easy to label or explain. Sometimes it just exists, and you learn how to live around it, or through it, or despite it. That's why the film feels more like an emotional experience than a traditional narrative. You don't just follow the story, you sit inside it, and when it ends, you don't really feel like you've solved anything. You feel like you've spent time inside someone else's unresolved emotional landscape.